Hello! Like most of my videos, I can do this one off the cuff. There's only 3 sentences I have on this iPad as a reference to this video. I didn't have radios, except for like people that have crazy conspiracies. Radios back in the day, meaning thousands of years ago. But they had something nearly identical. Yeah. When human beings breathe or they respirate air, they can have, like if you're running, the frequency of your in-breath and out-breath actually changes, or if you're incredibly calm, the frequency of your breath is a longer frequency, right? And even longer still if you're sleeping, or if you're in a special state, a special jhanic state. By the way, the root word for jhana is jyati, means to burn, yeah? I've got an article on the methodology, which is going to be inserted into my retroduction booklet. But I want to tie this into something that I've made. It's nearly a perfect analogy. It's not totally perfect, but it's the best analogy that I've ever seen in my life, and it's a really good one. And I have countless videos about it. It's the radio analogy. And it's the distinction between mind, or nous, or spiritus sanctum. These are all one and the same thing. In relationship to the consubstantiality of that with the radio. There's no fire inside this iMac. There's no signal inside of a radio, right? There's no soul inside of a body, but that's not a denial of the soul. This is the heinous mistake the so-called Buddhists like to say. Buddha said that, use the word anatta, and this meant no soul. It's like, well, it's never used in that fashion. As an expert Pali translator, I've been translating Pali now for over 22 years. There's no such passage. A, B, C, X, Y, Z are not the soul. That, of course, would be a fallacy of composition. Well, this is not soul, and that's not soul, and that's not the soul. And it taught there was no soul. And, of course, that's not the case. It's common via negativa. This is this apophatic or neti-neti methodology of objective negation leads to subjective synthesis. It's really, really important what I just said there, whether you like it or not. Yeah, it's called the via negativa. By denying these objective things, you're giving affirmation to that which is not an object to be witnessed, because it is, of course, pure subjectivity. Anyway, there's a perfect radio analogy that the ancients used, and they used it as a teaching. It's not a teaching, it's actual apophatic method. It's a jhanic method to enter into a jhanic state of pure synthesis, pure theurgy, yeah? And of course the word jhana means to burn, but what are you burning? You're burning away objectivity, which of course leaves pure subjectivity, yeah? Throw the wood in the fire, it's like, you got a gold coin that got dropped in a pile of wood. You can't find it. It's like, I was going to throw it all on top of the fire. The wood's going to burn away, and of course what's going to be left is the gold coin. Of course, you can't take that analogy too far. The gold coin is also an object. Either way, the only way any signal by any radio on this earth ever created is that it actually has to have a transverse modulation, a frequency. Let's harken back to what I said a couple minutes ago, relative to one's breath. Yeah, short breath, long breath, and there's Majjhima Nikaya 3.81. This also to be included in the article that I'm writing. I don't want to, talk about the article, which is a few pages long, but they actually had a perfect radio analogy before there was a radio. And this, of course, is the signal, which, of course, is not in the body. Now, we breathe in air. We respirate. This is the animus, that which gives animation to a radio. The most expensive, I've owned some of the most expensive radios, ham radios anyway, that money can buy. There's no signal in the radio. Yeah, and the broadcast is not the signal. Broadcast is the interpolation of the signal by processors, AD converters, blah, 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 blah. Of course, it depends on whether it's an analog radio or a digital radio, but that distinction is not needed. There's no signal in the radio.
5 to 15 miles an hour.
This particular signal is at 162.400 megahertz. Yeah. There's no breath in the body. We do take breath in literally, but it is not part of the body. That which gives life to the body, yes, analogously anyway. And of course without it, you're going to die, right? You say someone stopped breathing, the ultimate implication of that is that they're dead. There are a few instances where someone is apparently not breathing, but of course they are breathing. Without breath, someone is not long for this world. Yes? This breath of life, not literal breath, and yet there are so many millions of people. And that's what this article, not just about that, but a whole scope around that and getting to the facts, logic, and wisdom of what is actually being taught versus what is taught conventionally. And this is where religion and metaphysics subdivide, and this is where existential calming completely spits off the tracks and off the roads from the metaphysics of liberation ontology, because people say, well, oh, you fat tattooed bald guy, when I focus on my breath, I feel so much more calm, I'm able to handle stress better. It's like all these things are true, but this is about existential well-being. Yes? This is about being spatially coherent rather than a point source, analogously. You do feel better, your day is better, the stress is removed, but that is in no way whatsoever directly linked to liberation and the wisdom advocated thereof, which would be one-pointedness where one is completely concentrated. What's the opposite of concentration? It would be dilution. Yes, don't mean concentrating, because you can't think your way out of a thinking box. But they did have this perfect radio analogy back then. It's nearly as perfect as my radio analogy, where I actually talk about the consubstantiality. And of course, for spirit and matter to have union in consubstantiality, which of course is life, you need a third thing. And that third thing, in the case of life, is water. Water is the dipole antenna for the manifestation of consciousness. Consciousness is the consubstantiality between matter and spirit. Consciousness goes no further than the psychophysical body. Yes, this is a fact. It goes no further than the psychophysical body. Water is the antenna which makes life possible, of course. I'll give the pseudo translation in the article that I'm working on. This is about being antecedent. I don't know if you're familiar with the word antecedent. It means being prior to. This metaphor, which has been literalized by soul-denying existentialists, like, well, if I focus on my breath, I feel better, and that stress is removed, and, just feel better about my day, I'm able to tackle tomorrow. It's like, this is true, but this is not connected to liberation or the liberation ontology thereof. The breath passes in and out of the body, but it is, of course, not part of the body, but without it, life is not possible. This is the metaphysical symbolism. And by the way, we have the same root word of the ancient Pali, which goes to Sanskrit, in English too. In Pali the word is Atan, which by the way is the exact same term in ancient Egyptian. In Sanskrit the word is Atman. In English we have the same root, atmosphere, atmospheric, which is of course about the blowing of winds. What's the atmosphere going to be like today, Janet? It's going to be windy and cloudy and sunny, blah, 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 blah. Right? Literally the blowing of air. Literally. Of course that's about meteorology. Weather. The animus, or the breath of life, is not literalized. It's the analogy of talking about the frequency, the modulation, short breaths and long breaths from Majjhima Nikaya 3.81, which I'll give in the article. It's just a human radio analogy speaking of the signal. In this case, the animus, or the breath of life, is the signal, which is not part of the body, but which gives, because without the breath, sucking in air and exhaling it, a person dies, right? So it's their ancient radio analogy. No different than my radio analogy, which is a little more accurate and a little bit easier to explain to people. It's about being antecedent to the animus. It's not about focusing on breath, which is ridiculous. That would be as ridiculous as focusing on there's no difference between the breath that comes in and out of our lungs and the breath that's flowing through the tree leaves, going outside and trying to focus on how the wind is blowing through the trees. Well, how is that in any way connected to liberation? Well, the answer is, of course, it's not. It's just an ancient radio analogy, no different than mine, except the human body, in this case, is the radio, and the signal, and the long breaths or the short breaths, i.e. the frequency, just like any radio, because without modulation, yes, no signal is tunable. You actually have to have a frequency or wavelength, i.e. the transverse phenomena of light. And by the way, radio is nothing other than a different frequency of light. Visible light is EMF, just as radio signal 162.400 megahertz is also too light, except it is radio. It's called radio, but it's all EMF. Yeah, that which makes it possible. Take the most expensive radio in the world, remove the antenna, And unless the broadcaster is like 20 feet away or even a mile away and broadcasting extremely high power, you're not going to get anything. Oh, this is the best radio in the world. It's like, yeah, but you don't have an antenna on it. That's why you're not getting anything. Everything in ham radio is about antennas. So this has been literalized by existentialists, by phenomenalists, but it's nothing other than the ancient metaphor, ancient analogy of the radio analogy that I use regarding the signal versus the broadcast. You know, what is the interlocutor between the two? What is the animus that makes us draw in short breaths or draw in long breaths, which keeps us alive? Because the human being, of course, is animated and alive because, of course, we have to take food in and drink water. We're talking about you can last days without food and water. Without, sucking air in your lungs, you're not going to last about that long. Not literally, but not too much longer than that, right? You know it. I know it. I especially know that having nearly drowned a couple times scuba diving. No breath. You're not going to be around very long. So it is not about literal breath, and it is not about literal air. It is about the animating principle. It's not you're literally focusing on the breath. Well, I focus on my breath. I feel so much better. Well, yes, you do. And it's a stress reliever. And this is good. But it is no way connected to liberation, nor is it that was actually being taught. And I have the Sutta passage for this. I translated it in 2001, Majjhima Nikaya 3.81. Yeah, I have it in the article. But it's just another radio analogy. It's just the ancient radio analogy. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Anyway, I hope this was slightly illuminating and gave you a clue into something that nobody else is talking about. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.